Everyone, name's Kyle Lynch. Today I'll be talking about Herbert Hoover, FDR, and the Great Depression. So, the Great Depression. Man, that was a mess and a half. So, when we talk about the Great Depression, we're talking about the period where the market completely and utterly crashed. It didn't just go into a recession, no, it went down into the dirt. Now, Herbert Hoover had 8 months in office at the time the Great Depression started. This means that he was responsible for all the early reforms of the Great Depression until FDR got into power. So, let's talk about Herbert Hoover in comparison to FDR. Herbert Hoover was a proponent of small government. He didn't like government meddling with the affairs of the people, and did not want government to overextend itself. So, instead of going for direct government intervention, he did indirect government intervention. He reached out to charities. He reached out to local level governments to help support the effort to fix the Great Depression. He pretty much had to struggle blindly through and lay the groundwork for FDR's New Deal, because holy cow, did he need to do a lot of legwork. Okay, so the banking reforms that are part of FDR's New Deal, Herbert Hoover had them first and was struggling to get them passed through Congress during the end of his time in office. And that was pretty much him throwing things at the wall to see what would stick. Herbert Hoover completely deserves a huge amount of credit for actually managing to keep the country functional. The country probably would have been far worse without his efforts at scrambling at the wall, trying to make sure that the U.S. didn't fall into complete and utter disrepair. When FDR entered office, he was skeptical of the New Deal because he didn't like the government overreach. He understood the banking reforms. He was actually completely behind them because those were the reforms he was trying to get passed to save the banking system, which was on the cusp of complete collapse when FDR took office, because Congress was dragging its feet. Sounds familiar to the modern day circumstances of Congress dragging its feet about a lot of issues. Congress dragging its feet is nothing new. FDR, man, was the guy controversial to the Supreme Court. So he proposed a huge amount of agencies for direct federal aid. But he is not responsible for the federal labor agencies. That was all not responsible for the original federal labor agencies. That was Herbert Hoover. Yes, Herbert Hoover, the guy who was a massive proponent of small government and didn't want to expand the government's reach, is responsible for the work agencies which FDR co-opted into his New Deal. FDR was absolutely amazing at co-opting our programs. He also had an immense dislike for the Supreme Court and tried to stack it in his favor multiple times, which is hilarious because he did manage to get some Supreme Court reforms through, but he just did not agree with the Supreme Court because they completely and utterly defanged some of his early agencies that were part of the New Deal. A couple of his agencies were ruled unconstitutional. He had to completely fight against the judicial department to actually solve certain problems of the Great Depression. And then there's the lovely efforts that both of them put into saving the entire banking industry as a whole. Herbert Hoover is the reason why the banks lasted so long, but FDR was the one that solved the problem in the end. So yes, the Great Depression, defined by Herbert Hoover and FDR. FDR is one that everybody remembers for fixing the Great Depression with the New Deal, just like how Theodore Roosevelt did the Square Deal. So yeah, whenever a deal comes up in a conversation, it's likely going to be either an FDR or a Roosevelt, especially when it comes to politics. Well, it's always a Roosevelt. You know what I mean. But Herbert Hoover, yeah, he was a progressive Republican when the Democrats were the conservative party. FDR was a progressive Democrat when the Democratic Party was still conservative. It's weird to wrap your head around. Especially because this was the time where the parties were doing a transition to the opposite. Herbert Hoover's Republican Party was far more progressive than its later generations, but it was at the time of after Herbert Hoover got out of office where the Republican Party started becoming more conservative, which I found was interesting in my research. And just like FDR is the reason why the Democratic Party is so progressive. Anywho, that's all for today.